Next up, to her right, is Professor Patricia Brasser-Sellers, who serves as the Special Advisor on Slavery Crimes to the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. To her right is Belkis Izquierdo, who's a judge at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia, and she is joined by Ana Elena Abello, legal officer also at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Next up is Professor Priya Morley, Director at the International Human Rights Clinic and Racial Justice Policy Council at Promise Institute at UCLA Law. And to her right is Christina Becker, Associate Director of Racial Justice and Equity at the US Program at Human Rights Watch. Thank you all so much for joining us. I give now over to Dr. Hissing Branger for the first intervention.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you everyone for your attendance this morning and being part of this conversation. My task this morning, as agreed with my fellow panelists, was really to just lay a bit of the foundation, applying it to your various mandates and programs of action. So what does it mean if I want to decolonize the work that I do if I'm a member of civil society? What does it mean if I want to decolonize the work that I do if I'm a diplomat? What does it mean if I want to decolonize the work that I do if I work directly with victims and survivors? So I think the first thing is, why do we use the language of decolonization? And there is an important and deliberate pivot towards that. And the reason I think for us to think about and to be in conversation is to really not only unearth and look at what happened in a kind of colonial era, but also the afterlife therein. So it is to collapse the time and space boundary between when colonialism ended and how it continues to manifest today, but to recognize that in fact there are not only legacies, but there are new forms of colonial logics that exist. There are new ways in which colonial violence continues to be perpetuated. There are new types of visibilities when it comes to thinking about whose harm is being considered, acknowledged, recognized by, quote, the international community, quote, international justice. But not only that, it asks us to think about what is the role of law when it comes to imagining a world that is anti-colonial, that is structured on a decolonial imagination. What does it mean? And I think for me, it means fundamentally shaking this idea that we have certain hierarchies of humanity. Some people's humanity matter than others. Some people's victimization matter than others. Because that is the very fundamental tenet of what colonial logics is about. A racialized understanding of the world and an exploitation of people, of land, of property, of the destruction of cultures, of a project of assimilation, of a sense of destruction. So what does it mean to reimagine a world in a 21st century through the eyes of a decolonial understanding? And so if we take that broader sense of the picture and then bring it down, it means, on the one hand, the law's role, international law's role, international legal institutions have a responsibility to bear when reckoning with racial justice. We must and have to talk about race within international justice. And that will manifest and shape itself in different ways depending on what situation, country we're looking at, what jurisdiction we're considering. It is to understand the antecedents of these ways in which society is divided in a particular context. So I come from a beautiful small country, the Gambia, and we can see immediate ties to how our society is structured today when it comes to thinking about Gambia under British colonial rule. It is a falsehood to pretend that that no longer exists, that by gaining independence and self-determination, that somehow we were freed from the shackles of that colonial domination and imagination. That may persist. The perpetrators or the individuals may look different. The apparatus of the state may look different. But there are many ways in which the coloniality of gender manifests itself and invades itself in our ways that we respond to sexual and gender-based violence. It's the ways in which our different ethnic minorities or tribal groups in the Gambia are understood in our politics. There are so many examples of an afterlife to colonialism, but also new modalities within that in just my country. And so when I look at my research and my work with activists around transitional justice in the Gambia, it is highly important that we are not only sensitive to that, but we are reactive to it. We are active in thinking about how we shape and how we change and transform societies. So I think for me, for those of you who come from a civil society background and work in many different contexts, you will be familiar with things that you will see and wonder the kind of structures and causes of conflict and violence. And I think this is also where the invitation to understand decolonial methodology as a way to unearth these structural ways of harm, a structural harm that thinks about the before, the present, and the future. And it also acknowledges structural harms that are not just representative in the courtroom, right? So when we think about culpability for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, do we ever think about the arms trade within the context of that? Do we think about resources and the exploitation? Do we think about land and the competition for land and resource? Do we think about climate change and maybe the ways that that exacerbates? And by that, I think we start to unearth a mode of analysis where we understand what international justice is trying to do, what harms we are trying to visibilize, and then how we can respond better. And I think there are different roles for different institutions, whether we're thinking about big institutions like the ICC or civil society organizations such as Human Rights Watch, the Emergent Justice Initiative, a range of different civil society actors. But I think it is more than simply doing a token bottom-up approach. It is thinking holistically, thematically, and yes, radically about doing our work differently. And it can be at many different levels. It can be at the normative sense. What crimes do we visibilize and we don't? How do we address those particular crimes? His Excellency talked about the omission of the crime of slavery, and I think that's one example, and a powerful example of the ways in which we have erased what is a very jarring part of our global history. But not only at the normative level, what are the ways operationally that we do things differently if we understand a decolonizing impetus as a mode and a method of analysis and of working? And so I think for me, to kind of just wrap up the points before handing over to my fellow panelists, is to just get us to disrupt our norm. We can't add decolonial thinking and not think that it doesn't disrupt our current working practices. That is the first thing I want to invite you to consider, to take on, and to just metabolize for a minute, right? And so in doing that, how do we step forward into a decolonized future? And I think part of that is, again, to deal with how we think about racism, an anti-racist international justice model, an international justice world. What does it mean when we take racism and an anti-racist commitment seriously, right at the center of the work that we do, and not at the periphery?
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So I'm going to take it down before taking it up and be a little professorial. But I do want to make one observation. I think this is among the first time that we are putting forth some of these ideals related to slavery and the slave trade to what I would presume is an audience that is okay with feminism. Okay? And okay with a feminist critique of feminism also. So let me start this way, to say that decolonization of international law refers to, the reins or the tethers that the colonial systems still exert, these retentions on our current legal system, even though colonialism has ended or has gone into what could be termed post-colonial legal systems. And the explicit inclusion or exclusion, and in particular the hidden exclusion, the ones we don't even think of certain international crimes, such as the slave trade, are rampantly invisible within our international criminal law system. And that's a colonial retention. Slavery crimes and their presence, and most notably their absence in contemporary international law, offers us a prime example of how we are walking in the fog and thinking that we are in sunlight. But first let me switch, because it is unusual that I'm in front of a completely feminist audience with these ideas. And so I want to lay a bridge out. And this is my bridge, that we know during the past 25 years that feminists have surfaced the Victorian coloniality of international criminal law by challenging the use of such terms as family honor or being ravaged, reinterpreting that phrase of outrageous upon personal dignity. That was a decolonization, a Victorian way of looking at sex and sexuality. And we challenge not having enumerated in many statutes provisions such as forced sterilization or forced pregnancy. That was a feminist decolonization of international criminal law. Right now we kind of cringe when we hear that language and just see the patriarchy easing out of all the conceptual notions. I would also say our lack of using the crime of forced prostitution, it doesn't quite feel right anymore. So decolonizing the law by feminists in many ways has been an ongoing project. Slavery crimes, of which I mean slavery or enslavement and the slave trade, have a different but just as troublesome relationship to international criminal law and to our so-called, soi-disant, post-colonial societies. So most societies in what we now call the New World, the Americas, from which I'm from, North America, South America, and the Caribbean, were entangled with the economies of the Old World, which is a colonial. But the Nuremberg judgment, as most feminists are first to cry, doesn't contain the word rape, but it contains an entire section about the slave labor policy of the Nazi regime. And that there were thousands of Poles and Belgians and Dutch who were enslaved by the Nazis, without bringing forward the racialization of that enslavement. We forget that because we want to think of enslavement as belonging to the African races. And within the Nazi regime, we have the phrase of, within the London Charter, of deportation to slave labor, as if we step back from saying that the Poles, the Belgians, the Dutch were slave traded into Germany to work on factories, to work in the agricultural section, to work for the war effort. We step away from that, and that has a racial connotation. And if we move to Asia and see the comfort women, we know that not only were they enslaved, they were slave traded all over the Asia Pacific. But yet we have no jurisprudence that redresses any of the acts that concern them. Those are colonial retentions. In the subsequent wars, whether they be in Bosnia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, Uganda, slavery and the slave trade as facts continue to be perpetrated. However, and please note, there is not one international law instrument that has a provision for the slave trade in it, as if the slave trade had suddenly stopped in 1926, or maybe 1888, or maybe 1863. Of course it didn't. But our international legal analysis stopped with the slave trade. Please note that the slave trade was mostly trade of enslaved persons in the interior of their countries, not across the Atlantic Ocean or eastward through Zanzibar. The internal slave trade was the slave trade between Maryland and New Orleans, Bahia and San Luis, Bogota and Medellin. And today that internal slave trade is a slave trading of child soldiers among militia groups, and reassigning enslaved females that are Yazidis to new fighters' families. But we have no provision in international law that captures those acts. And so I want to conclude by saying that our misunderstanding, our refusal to acknowledge historical slavery, is crippling the way that we approach current acts that are really slavery and the slave trade. In particular, our misunderstanding of how sexualized most enslavement was, whether it was with males or females. Enslaved males did not own their semen. They had to produce it at their slave master's will. Even our provision today of sexual slavery is far too inadequate and limiting. I personally would place all of the sexualized acts of enslavement back within our understanding, or rather our misunderstanding of slavery. I'll conclude by saying that there are 3 current processes in which we would ask you to join in to lift the fog and to really walk into a more enlightened view. And I don't mean French Enlightenment from the 1700s, because, interesting little factoid, when the French Revolution abolished slavery, probably because Haiti kind of pushed them toward it, Napoleon reinstated slavery. Can you imagine having it abolished and then reinstated? But I'm talking about true enlightenment, to make the legal framework between slavery and the slave trade complete and whole. And the third process is a process that at the Office of the Prosecutor next year, we will be putting forward a slavery crimes policy to review and to look and to go forward with our work as it relates to contemporary acts of slavery and the slave trade. I'm joined by my OTP colleagues, other special advisors. I really hope to be joined by you, stakeholders, in that process going forward next year. We have to untie the colonial retentions. They are both psychological, but they are also factual. And they also allow us to live and to promote impunity for some of the most serious crimes, use coercion crimes, that we have always pledged never to allow them to exist again. Thank you very much.
Un saludo de armonía para todos y todas. Yo agradezco mucho la invitación a este espacio para reflexionar la descolonización de la justicia internacional. Yo pensaría que es más que un verbo, es irnos a la práctica y a la implementación. Hay una urgente necesidad de posicionar los sistemas de conocimiento y los sistemas jurídicos que existen en muchos pueblos, en muchos territorios, en muchos países, para proteger los múltiples sistemas de vida, las vidas interrelacionadas, no solo humanas. Como relatora del caso 02, quiero compartirle algunas experiencias y unas prácticas decoloniales realizadas en la investigación de la situación territorial de 3 municipios ubicados en la costa del Océano Pacífico en Colombia, donde el 80% del territorio es étnico y el 90% de la población se autorreconoce como indígena o negra afrocolombiana. Esta investigación incorpora unos enfoques fundamentales para hacer ese proceso de colonización, entre ellos el enfoque étnico, racial, el enfoque territorial y el diálogo intercultural y el pluralismo jurídico.
Greetings of harmony. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this event and to reflect on ways to decolonize international justice, especially before the urgent need to position the diverse legal systems that exist in our territories to protect multiple life systems. As leading judge of Case 2, I will share some experiences and decolonial practices in the investigation of the territorial situation of 3 cities located on the coast of the Pacific Ocean, where 80% are ethnic territories and 90% of the people recognizes themselves as indigenous people or Black Afro-Colombians. This investigation incorporates fundamental approaches such as the gender and ethnic and territorial approaches and intercultural dialogue and legal pluralism.
Les compartiré 4 puntos. Lo primero que hemos venido haciendo, el reconocimiento y la acreditación del territorio como un sujeto de derecho y víctima del conflicto armado, resultado de la incorporación de los principios, las lógicas y las racionalidades de los sistemas de justicia de los pueblos étnicos en la justicia transicional. Su acreditación se da de acuerdo con la cosmovisión de cada uno de estos pueblos en sus correspondientes idiomas, en este caso el Katsasú del pueblo Incalagua y el Eperara Ewa del pueblo Eperara Siapidara. Para esto ha sido fundamental el abordaje de diferentes conceptos de lo que significa el territorio desde la ontología relacional para poder incorporar en las providencias judiciales la voz de los pueblos, la voz de los territorios, la voz de aquellas víctimas y sobrevivientes que tienen también un sistema de conocimiento.
I will address 4 points. The first one is the recognition and accreditation of the territory as subject of rights and victim of the armed conflict. This is the result of incorporating principles, logics, and rationalities of ethnic people in this transitional justice. Its accreditation is given in accordance with the views of each ethnic people in their own languages. For example, the Katsasú for the indigenous Awa and the Eperara Euja for indigenous Eperara Siapidara. And for this, it was essential to approach the different concepts of territory from the relational ontology and to include the voice of ethnic people and ethnic territory because they have their own knowledge systems in our decisions.
En segundo lugar, para la intervención de estos pueblos étnicos se concertaron rutas para establecer diálogos interculturales horizontales para participar en distintos momentos procesales como víctimas y como autoridades étnicas con sus respectivos intérpretes. Esto transformó las relaciones tradicionales asimétricas de poder y permitió una construcción colectiva y dialógica para el esclarecimiento de la verdad y la administración de justicia. Y en tercer lugar, a partir del diálogo intercultural y el análisis interseccional de la información aportada, avanzamos en identificar los daños graves, diferenciados y desproporcionados que sufrieron las víctimas tanto en su dimensión individual, colectiva y territorial, incluyendo una valoración desde la visión de los propios pueblos y comunidades. Por ello, el análisis no atendió únicamente a las categorías occidentales del daño, sino también a la dimensión espiritual, cultural y territorial que plantearon los pueblos, las comunidades, las mujeres y las personas LGBTIQ+.
In second place, for the participation of ethnic people, routes were agreed to establish horizontal and intercultural dialogues to participate in different procedural moments as victims or ethnic authorities with their respective interpreters. This transformed the traditional asymmetric relations of power and allowed the collective and dialogical construction for the clarification of truth and the administration of justice. In third place, based on intercultural dialogue and intersectional analysis of the information provided, we advanced on the identification of serious, differentiated, and disproportionate damages suffered by the victims and at the individual, collective, and territorial level, including a reading from the view of their own peoples and communities. Therefore, the analysis did not only address the Western categories of damages, but also the spiritual, cultural, territorial dimensions raised by the peoples and communities, women and LGBTQI+ people.
En cuarto lugar, la configuración de un proceso dialógico, restaurativa y con la participación de las víctimas y los sobrevivientes en su dimensión colectiva e individual nos permitió identificar otros patrones macrocriminales como fue la destrucción de la naturaleza y el territorio, así como visibilizar la discriminación estructural y exacerbada generada por el conflicto armado. En particular, en la decisión, el auto 3 del 5 de julio del 2023 de este año, realizamos una calificación jurídica propia, integrando diversas fuentes de derecho, entre ellas los sistemas jurídicos de los pueblos étnicos, para responder a un contexto de diversidad de género, diversidad étnica, diversidad cultural, diversidad lingüística y socioecológica, e imputar a miembros de la extinta guerrilla de la FARC los crímenes de lesa humanidad de exterminio, incluyendo el exterminio cultural, de los pueblos étnicos y el de persecución a pueblos étnicos, a mujeres, a niñas y a personas LGBTIQ+, considerando las violaciones graves a los derechos fundamentales, tanto individuales como colectivos. Con relación a los crímenes de guerra, se imputó la destrucción del medio ambiente natural, para lo cual por primera vez en la JEP se tuvo en cuenta un informe con expertos interculturales de los pueblos étnicos en los que desde su sistema de conocimiento se visibilizaron los daños a la naturaleza, al territorio ocasionados por vertimientos de petróleo, producto de los ataques al oleoducto trasandino y a la contaminación por minería criminal con mercurio. También se imputó el crimen de guerra de destrucción de bienes culturales y lugares de culto, dado que muchos sitios sagrados de los pueblos étnicos fueron violentados en el conflicto armado. Para ello, se interpretó de manera amplia el Estatuto de Roma en el sentido de que por lugares de culto no solo podrían ser los edificios religiosos, sino, por ejemplo, sitios sagrados como los ríos, las montañas, los lugares específicos de importancia espiritual desde la cosmovisión de los pueblos étnicos.
In fourth place, the configuration of a dialogic restorative process with the participation of individual and collective victims allow us to identify, among others, a pattern of microcriminality of destruction of nature and territory, and to make visible the structural discrimination exacerbated by the armed conflict. Particularly in the Chamber's decision of the 5th of July of this year, we used our sources of law, among which is ethnic peoples law, to respond to a context of gender, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and socio-ecological diversity, and to charge the members of the former guerrillas of FARC with crimes against humanity, such as extermination, which included cultural extermination of ethnic people, and ethnic gender persecution of ethnic people, women, girls, and LGBTQI+ people, taking into account the severe deprivation of individual and collective fundamental rights. We also charged war crimes as the destruction of natural environment, for which, for the first time in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, a report by intercultural experts from the ethnic people was taken into account, in which, from their knowledge systems, made visible the damages to nature and the territory caused by oil spilling as consequence of the attack to the Transatlantic pipeline and the contamination by criminal mining. The war crime of destruction of cultural property and places of worship, given that several sacred places of ethnic people were violated in the armed conflict, was also charged. To this end, the Rome Statute was interpreted broadly, in the sense that places of worship would not only be religious buildings, but also, for example, sacred places as rivers, mountains, or places of a specific spiritual importance from the views of ethnic people.
Estos son algunos de los ejemplos de cómo la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, en particular los casos territoriales como el 02, afrontan los desafíos que imponen las formas y los contenidos dominantes y generan propuestas para la descolonización, pretendiendo una comprensión de la verdad a la vez única y plural, desde múltiples cosmovisiones, desde sistemas de conocimientos e idiomas, y cuestiona la jerarquía impuesta sobre los saberes válidos de la justicia transicional en el mundo. Cierro señalando que el gran desafío es que la justicia transicional tome el derecho como una herramienta para transformar las realidades y avanzar en la justicia social y ambiental en los territorios, y no al contrario, que el derecho sea la realidad que limite la comprensión del conflicto y la gravedad de los daños. Estoy muy contenta en este espacio porque me he alimentado con la voz y las luces de ir más allá de la teoría, hacer la práctica y seguir implementando y seguir haciendo luz en una oscuridad, porque hemos olvidado también la multiplicidad de conocimientos que hay en los territorios, que hay en las comunidades, que hay en la diversidad de poblaciones. Muchas gracias.
So these are some of the examples in which the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, particularly in Case 2 and other territorial micro cases, face the challenges imposed by the dominant forms and contents, and generate decolonization proposals, seeking understanding of the truth, unique and plural at the same time, from multiple worldviews, knowledge systems, and languages, and to question the imposed hierarchy on the valid knowledge of transitional justice. As closing remark, I would like to point out that the greatest challenge is that transitional justice uses law as a tool to transform realities and to advance in achieving social and environmental justice in the territories, and not on the contrary, that law becomes the reality that limits the understanding of the conflict and the severity of damages. She also mentioned that she's very content and happy to be here because she's been enlightening herself with the proposals of the other experts to throw light on this important job of decolonizing. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Thank you first of all to Lily and all the organizers for the invitation to be here. It's such an honor to be on a panel with women whose work I admire so much. I have the pleasure of sharing some highlights from work that we have been doing at the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law to engage critically with the limits and potential of human rights, particularly as it relates to non-discrimination and equality. So in recent years, we've seen renewed solidarity across movements and borders, which has underscored the importance of a transnational understanding of racial justice. And this is particularly true when you consider issues like the global ecological crisis and related migrations, which are disproportionately impacting racialized people around the world, and particularly people in formerly colonized nations of the global south. At the same time, despite some significant strides, we've seen the limits of international law to fully contend with these global issues. So I want to intervene with 2 points from our work, which I hope will be a contribution to the really exciting conversation that we have today. So first, I will propose that human rights and international law scholars and practitioners can draw on the analytical tools offered by critical race theory and third world approaches to international law to center race and empire in their understanding of legal interventions and legal approaches. And then secondly, I'll describe our approach to race and climate injustice as an example of a critical engagement with human rights law in order to open new pathways for accountability for contemporary legacies of colonialism and enslavement. So first of all, building on some important gatherings of the past from 2019 until the present, UCLA has been holding a series of convenings that brought together critical race theory, TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law, and international law scholars to consider what an analytical lens that centers both CRT and TWAIL would look like, and to explore how the international human rights framework can promote racial justice and equality. As many in the room may know, but I'll just briefly offer an introduction, critical race theory explores how race is perpetuated by and through law. And here race can be understood as a social construction according to which physical features and lineage are imbued with social, political, and economic, and even legal meanings. So early CRT scholars observed how the US civil rights movement of the 1960s and the dominant anti-discrimination frameworks focused on acts of direct discrimination, but obscured how systemic racism was operating. And so they instead argued that racism is structural and historic, and it's embedded within our laws and legal institutions. So CRT scholars ask questions like how law constructs race, how law upholds racial hierarchies, and how law reproduces racial inequality. Similarly, but differently, TWAIL challenges the foundations and assumptions underlying the regime of international law and situates the contemporary international legal system as operating from and perpetuating empire. Empire describes the social, political, and economic interconnection among sovereign nations, but on fundamentally unequal terms that privilege the global north while perpetuating the subordination of formerly colonized nations in the global south. So this can include European colonialism and its legacies and other forms of this type of subordination. So TWAIL scholars ask questions like, did formal decolonization and the international law and institutions that arose from it lead to sovereign equality of formerly colonized states within the international legal system? Or is that sovereignty contingent on other factors, including the operations within these systems? So while CRT and TWIL arose both out of US legal academia in response to different legal systems, the US legal system and international, they both, in different ways, can confront similar structures of oppression. And they both contest how formal inclusion, whether it's the citizenship offered to Black Americans within the US system or sovereignty offered to formerly colonized nations in the international legal system, they contest what that formal inclusion has actually amounted to. And I propose, and our convenings are exploring, what CRT and TWIL together, that they can offer insights that can contribute to developing a sharp lens to uncover how race and empire operate within international law. So with this framing in mind, I'll now move to an example of the analysis and work that we've been doing around climate injustice as one way of thinking about a human rights analysis that's attentive to the operation of race and empire. And so for this, I'll draw on my colleague, Professor Tendai Achiume's report in her mandate as UN Special Rapporteur on Racism on the ecological crisis, climate justice, and racial justice, and related projects that we have. So the central thesis of this report is that the global ecological crisis is a racial justice crisis. And so what does that mean? First, that racial subordination and injustice are central to the processes of resource extraction, industrialization, and consumption that created and are still driving the ongoing ecological crisis. Historic emissions are a clear example of this. So climate change is the result of centuries of greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide, that have accumulated in the atmosphere over centuries. These historic emissions were produced through processes of industrialization and development that relied on systems of slavery and colonization, and that undergirded the economic growth of former colonial powers while underdeveloping former colonies. These global inequalities persist and shape who is most harmed by climate change today. Secondly, it is racially, ethnically, and nationally marginalized groups that are concentrated in so-called racial sacrifice zones who bear the brunt of pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change, as well as resulting in coerced displacement and immobility in the context of the global ecological crisis. So the concept of racial sacrifice zones describes regions that are rendered dangerous or even uninhabitable owing to environmental degradation. Because they are disproportionately located in racial sacrifice zones, racially marginalized people face disproportionate harms from the climate crisis. So taking an example from my own work, in Haiti, decades of slavery, colonization, and extractive industries have left Haitians extremely vulnerable to the effects of a changing climate, including hurricanes, loss of forests, and biodiversity, and soil erosion. This climate vulnerability is leaving many Haitians, and particularly farmers who can no longer make a living, forcing them to leave their homes. Yet throughout the Americas, as they journey through this continent, racism also limits their freedom of movement once they leave their country of origin. So the global ecological crisis impacts racially marginalized communities also in qualitatively different ways. For example, although climate change affects many human rights, as has come up on this panel, some violations are specific to indigenous peoples. This is exacerbated by extractive projects, which in many parts of the world are often taking place on or polluting indigenous territories. And degrading land to the point of inhabitability violates their rights to culture and freedom of religion, as traditional lands may be the material foundation of many tribal cultures and provide a physical means of connection for many indigenous belief systems or cosmologies. So understanding this link between race and colonialism and climate change, what I propose is that this is opening up a new pathway of accountability for violations that are the product of histories of slavery and colonialism. So as outlined in the report, and as many in this room are intimately aware, international law defines clear obligations for states to effectively and adequately redress and repair harms experienced by victims of human rights violations through adequate and effective reparations. And this includes violations of non-discrimination and equality obligations. It is also a longstanding principle of international law that victims must be provided with full and effective reparations, which may entail restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So reparations may take any or all of these forms as needed to adequately repair the harm. And a conventional analysis of international law often identifies many different legal hurdles to claims for reparations for colonialism and slavery, including the intertemporal principle, which posits that which prevents state accountability for violations of international law where the actions were legal at the time of commission. There are some exceptions to this principle, including when the act is ongoing or continues into a time when international law considered the act a violation, or when the wrongful act's direct ongoing consequences extend into a time when the act and its consequences are internationally wrongful. So this, as outlined in this report, means that claims for reparations for contemporary racial discrimination, including as a consequence of global ecological crisis, which are rooted themselves in histories of colonialism and slavery, must not be barred by the intertemporal principle. So contemporary racially discriminatory human rights violations are owing of reparations. And so we should understand that climate change itself and its disproportionate racialized impacts being rooted in slavery and colonialism means that in conceiving of remedies for these harms, we should be taking a structural approach to those reparations, which does not implicate only individual wrongful acts, but also the entire legal, economic, social, and political structures that enabled slavery and colonialism and which continue to sustain racial discrimination and inequality today. So this entails moral, economic, political, and legal responsibilities on the part of states, and means that states must be pursuing a just and equitable international order as an urgent dimension of these structural reparations for racially discriminatory human rights violations. So I'll stop there in the interest of time being quite over, but thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation, and to my fellow panelists. I've been learning a lot. I won't duplicate what they've said because I agree with everything they've said, both in theory and in practicality. So I work at Human Rights Watch, and our main focus is covering and reporting on human rights violations. But on top of that, we also focus on advocacy. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what decolonizing advocacy looks like. So one of our newest strategic priorities is employing decolonization and the anti-racism lens, not just in the issues we choose to cover, but also how we approach those issues. And that means both in written advocacy, oral advocacy, and also direct advocacy. Sorry, that's three. And so when I think about advocacy work, and I know that's applicable to a lot of people in this room, especially when you're doing direct advocacy, I think a lot about positionality. And that means recognizing that you're in a position of privilege and power a lot of times over the person that you're representing or that you're advocating for. A lot of times that you are the voice because their voices are being silenced or they're not being heard. And so recognizing what you must do as an advocate in that position. And that is thinking of race, money, the country that you come from, and who your connections are. And so when you're thinking about positionality and decolonization and your approach, when you put all that together, when you talk about decolonization, you talk about not only documenting racial harms, but how to repair those harms as well. And I think that this is important to think about both of those things as you're advocating for somebody. And when you're advocating for somebody, you want to think about the truth and healing. And what I mean by truth is that making sure that you're naming exactly what's happening. And that's racism, misogyny, white supremacy, and often anti-Blackness. As part of its racial justice work, the U.S. program focuses on reparations, particularly for formerly enslaved people and their descendants who have suffered from slavery and its legacies. And one of the issues that HRW has covered that I think most exemplifies this sort of new approach and cross-divisional work, and I think encompasses a lot of what the other panelists have said, is our work on Chagos. And I've been told that I'm really good at getting people to be as outraged as I am. So I invite you to get angry with me as I talk about the colonial history of Chagos. For those who are unfamiliar, Chagos is a string of islands to the east of the southern tip of Africa and south of Indonesia and the Indian Ocean. Chagosian people are descendants of formerly enslaved Africans and Indian indentured servants. They have lived on the island of Chagos for over 2 centuries, creating their own culture, their own language, their own Creole, their own customs, and also their own music, which has been recognized by UNESCO. The Chagos Islands were under the jurisdiction of Mauritius until the UK gained control of Mauritius and all of its territories. Mauritius gained its independence, and this is sort of all part of a package deal that the UK and the US brokered. Mauritius gained its independence, but Chagos did not. Chagos moved under the jurisdiction of the UK. So that means while countries were decolonizing, so this is around the mid to late 60s. While other countries were decolonizing, the UK was forming an additional African colony. The United States wanted one of the main island, Diego Garcia, to use as a strategic military base. So I want to be clear that Chagos became a colony of the UK as a result of the United States direction. It is the brainchild of the United States. So while US gave Mauritius money to take ownership, possession of Chagos, the United States also gave UK, I believe it was 14 million pounds to use the largest island, Diego Garcia, to build a military base. So during 1968 to 1973, the US and the UK, physically it was the UK government who was there, forcibly removed Chagosians from their territory, often by gunpoint. They moved them onto ships. They destroyed all of their property. They razed their homes. They gassed their pets in front of them, as obviously a symbol of intimidation. And then they shipped them to the Seychelles and to Mauritius, splitting apart their communities, splitting apart families, and taking away a lot of their agency. Now, during this time, you probably are wondering, well, how in the world did the UK do this under a veil? Well, the UK lied. They, when they took possession of Chagos Islands, they told the UN that there wasn't anyone living on the islands. And so they were granted access. And HRW recently released a report on Chagos where they had access to a lot of the original documents between the UK government and the US government. And one thing that was very, very clear is the tone of white supremacy and racism that was embedded in a lot of the documents, where they made fun of their race, they made fun of their position in the world, and just overall dehumanize them, which is what we see over and over again when we talk about, colonization, right? There's a reason why people can do these horrific things to other human beings, and that's because they've dehumanized them. So the UK, with the direction of the US, created another African colony and re-traumatized the Black and brown people after they'd already been exploited by those countries for their labor. Since then, Chagosians have been fighting for their right to return. They fought in the courts, they fought in small individual ways, like, for example, applying for civilian jobs on the base. They have been denied every single time. One of the Chagosian leaders, his name is Olivier Bankou, I think he said he applied 19 times to work on the base, and he was denied every single time. No Chagosian up to this date has been able to work on the base, despite the fact that people from other countries have been able to. So people from the Philippines, the Seychelles, and Mauritius have all been allowed on the base as civilian workers. The fight to return to their land was initiated by Chagosian women. And as they have aged and passed away without ever seeing their home again, the younger Chagosians have taken up the mantle, Mr. Olivier Bankou being one of them. His mother and sister were part of the original fight. They have both passed, and he was 4 years old when he was forced off the island and still remembers his homeland to this day. He and others have been fighting from the early 1970s up until this date. So their struggle has been on multiple fronts, partially in the UK government or UK courts, and partially in the UN courts. So from 1973 to 2022, successive UK governments, with one exception, has refused to recognize the Chagosians' right to return and to live on Chagos in dignity and prosperity. The United States has supported the UK in their refusing to the right to return, their argument being that it is would jeopardize the safety and security of the base. More successes have been had in the international courts, and the International Court of Justice in 2019 found that Britain's ownership was unlawful, and that is because that they misrepresented to the UN previously that there were no people and no indigenous people living on the islands. So their ownership was declared unlawful, and that they should be allowed the right to return as, quote, as rapidly as possible. In 2021, a separate UN maritime court in Hamburg found that the UK's control of the islands amounted to an unlawful occupation. So this is an atrocity. This is an occupation that has been documented internationally, but it has not yet happened, or they have not yet been allowed to return home. The US officials last year acknowledged some US responsibility, but the most they would give us is, it is regrettable what happened to the Chagosian people, which means nothing. On November 3rd of last year, the UK Foreign Secretary said it intends to come to an agreement, still vague, on issues relating to the Chagosian people. Up until this point, there have been discussions about the UK returning Chagos to Mauritius. And Mauritius the Mauritius government has said if that happens, they will allow the Chagosians to return to their home and to be autonomous. The Chagosians have asked for not just a right to return home, but for reparations, which is very understandable, because they had all of their property destroyed. So they have asked for the US and the UK to pay compensation and to help rebuild their villages and some of the infrastructure that was destroyed when they left. The UK had recently stated that they hope to come to an agreement before the end of this year. And up until this point, we've been very hopeful. However, as of yesterday, there is a heartbreaking update. The new Defense Secretary, Cameron, wants to end plans to hand the Chagos Islands over to Mauritius. And that he approached the new Foreign Secretary, Cameron, urging him to do so. The UK is afraid that it will endanger its relationship with the US government and its allies' defense interests. So as of yesterday, it seems that these negotiations may fall apart, and that the Chagosians, who've been very hopeful up to this point that they'll get to return home, is now taken off the table. And so advocacy is really important now, because I think the US in particular has been able to operate sort of under this cloak for a really long time, because a lot of people don't understand that how much of a role the US played in this development. And what HRW has asked for is not only reparations and the right to return home, but an apology, because I think a lot of it starts with an apology and recognition of harm in the first place, which the US has not done. And we would ask also that that the Chagosians be centered in this. Again, going back to the decolonization of advocacy, because when the settlements are between the US, the UK, and Mauritius, the Chagosians are not at the table at all. And I'm sure they've been sort of consulted along the way, but they don't even have a voice. And I think this is exactly what happens when we don't center the people that are being victimized. Because I think it's a lot harder to look in the faces of people who have been victimized, especially by you, and say, we're not doing this anymore. But they are so faceless in this struggle, and that's sort of what has allowed this development to happen. Of course, we're still going to advocate, we're still going to urge the US and UK governments to continue these talks and to incorporate the terms of the Chagosian people and allow them to return home. And unfortunately, there's just been a setback, but I'm still hopeful.
Thank you very much to all our panelist speakers. I acknowledge we ran dramatically over time. However, I would like, if there are any questions in the room, to take up to 5 questions. If you have questions, kindly identify yourself with your name and your affiliation, and to whom the question is directed to.
Discussions, and thank you for the questions and the comments. To Ahmed, I really appreciated your intervention, because I think a decolonizing of international justice, if I may just take this step forward and say, to me, we have to uncouple it from our understanding of law as equal to justice. Where is our concept of freedom within the idea of justice? At the very center. As you said, you could have a statute that has all the crimes that we imagine to rectify, to respond to speak to history, past, present, and future. But where is our struggle for freedom? Because there are many people on this planet, and we've heard very powerful examples and testimonies and stories of what is a struggle for freedom attached to the concept of justice. So international justice and a decolonized imagination centers our struggle for freedom.
Any other comments from the panelists? If not, I would give over to Carmen Chankama, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Justice and Accountability, for closing today's event.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who is still here, and that we are so over time with so many things to go to. So I actually would like to end with a way that we sometimes traditionally start these meetings, which is with an acknowledgement of where we are, a territorial acknowledgement. And so I want to acknowledge that we are located in the ancestral and ceded homelands of the Lenape people. And we are guests on these lands. And so to be guests on these lands is also to recognize the significance of these lands to Lenape nations, both past and present. And that New York City, where the UN is headquartered, has the largest urban indigenous population in the United States. And I make this territorial acknowledgement because it is part of the disentanglement that we've been talking about today. The revealing of the structural indigenous exclusion and erasure in the very spaces that we all presently occupy right now. But as we've also discussed today, acknowledgement is really just the first small step towards providing remedy, which both Professor Sellers and Justice Inquisitero Torres spoke of, and the repair that Professor Morley spoke of the legacies of colonialism, and the ongoing effects and realities of settler colonialism that are within the very institutions where we currently work, which both the panelists and some of our commentators have spoken on today. And I think it is also a really important and poignant reminder of the importance that Indigenous knowledge plays in the new ways forward that Madam Justice has also pointed us towards. So just to tie just a few things that we discussed today, I think Dr. Bringer and Professor Morley really surfaced the linkages and new ways in which for us to work, and also new ways for us to repair both the histories of colonialism. Professor Sellers points to the tethers and the hidden exclusion of certain international crimes, such as slavery crimes. But Justice Inquisitero Torres also provides a really brilliant example of how these hidden crimes are beginning to become untethered as a result of her efforts and the work in her community. And Ms. Becker illustrates the necessity of self-examination in advocacy work and in all of our practice as we do this work. And how colonization is not just an artifact of history, which is also something that our colleague from Mohawk so importantly raises. And so dismantling is a start, but specific remedy of repair and reparation to concretely address the harm, that's what this panel has attempted to address, and that's what this entire justice project for us aims to be. So I'm going to end with what I think has been the catchphrase of our day, which is decolonization is a verb. And I send you all forth with that. Thank you very much.